Hi, I'm Grant Collier, and I'm going to be showing how I process this image in both Lightroom and Photoshop. This was actually primarily processed in Photoshop. It may look like a fairly basic image, but I actually did quite a few different things in post-processing, primarily to reduce noise and get the highest quality image that I can. And one problem with this image is that on the compressed video, the sky here is probably going to look pretty bad. It's probably going to show a lot of banding, but I have practice images you can follow along with, and you'll be able to see a better quality sky with the images that you're working with. And with this image, I actually took 75 different images and combined them in order to create this single image. And I took two images for the sky. You can see the very first image here for the sky was taken during twilight when Orion had just become visible and some of the bright stars around it were visible. And in post-processing, I decided to bring out the stars a little more to make Orion more visible like it is here. And so I'm going to show you how I did that. And then in this image, you can also see that the moon is just kind of one overexposed blob. And I didn't like this, so instead I used a moon from this shot where the moon appears as a sun star. And the way I was able to get the moon to appear as a sun star was to use a much smaller aperture, in this case f14. The shot here was taken at f2.8, and I almost always shoot at wide apertures at night because they let in a lot more light and you can get better quality images. But I couldn't get the sun star effect at f2.8. So at f14, I was able to get this nice sun star effect. The problem with shooting at f14 is, as you can see, there's a lot of noise in the sky versus a shot at f2.8 where there's far less noise. You can hardly see any noise in this image. And so what I did was I used only the moon from this shot and the sky from this shot in the final image. And now you can see after this I have a bunch of shots of the foreground. What I did here was I just panned directly down from the shot of the sky to get the shot of the foreground so that I could later line up the land here with the land in this shot. And so I actually took 72 different images of the foreground. And the reason I did this is because I can later stack them and get images with quite a bit less noise. And I'll zoom in here and show you the noise in this image. You can see quite a bit of noise in the land in this image. And this wouldn't be a problem if you're just viewing the image on the web or if you're making even small prints of the image. But if you want to get really large prints of the image, it's going to be problematic with all the noise. And of the 74 exposures that I took for the land, the first 24, which I have highlighted here, I had focused on the distant background, and also some of these rocks were in focus, but the nearest rocks were a little bit out of focus. For the remaining 48 shots, I focused on the near foreground, and I'll explain a little more why I took 48 shots for that later. But for the first 24 exposures, each of them were 30 seconds long. And so by combining all of these in Photoshop, I was effectively able to get 12-minute exposure, which let in a lot more light and minimize the noise. Now you may be wondering why I didn't just take one single 12-minute exposure. The reason I didn't do this is because with really long exposures like that, you can start to get a lot of dark noise in the image. And dark noise is characterized by sort of a red discoloration across the image and a lot of hot pixels. And with shorter exposures, you get less dark noise, and even by combining a lot of shorter exposures, you end up getting less dark noise. With one 12-minute exposure, I could have used a long exposure and noise reduction or a dark frame, which I'll go over later, but you still get better quality images by combining multiple short exposures than you do by doing one really long exposure. And when taking this image, I was trying to get the entire scene in sharp focus, but I realized that I couldn't quite get the close foreground in sharp focus. You can see here that the close foreground is a little bit out of focus, and even here it's out of focus. And so since I wasn't able to get the entire scene in focus in this shot, I decided to do a second series of exposures for just the immediate foreground. And you can see here that this is in much sharper focus than it was in the previous shot. And I found that I had to open up the aperture a little bit to f4.0 in order to get sharp focus throughout the foreground. And at f4.0, I was letting in half as much light as I did at f2.8. This is because there's a one-stop difference between f2.8 and f4.0. And since I was letting in half as much light, in order to get the same quality image as I did with the first 24 images, I needed to take twice as many images, or 48 total images. And so what I'll do later is I'll take the background from all of these images and combine it with the foreground of all of these images. And I'll do that after I stack all of these images together. And if you want to find out more about capturing these images in the field, I do have an ebook and also a paperback version of the book called Collier's Guide to Night Photography at collierpublishing.com. This video primarily goes over how to post-process the images. So the book goes in detail about how to take the images in the field. And one final image that I took here is called a dark frame. And this was taken by putting on my lens cap and closing my eyepiece and taking a shot with the same shutter speed and ISO settings as I had used with all of these images here. And this was done in order to reduce dark noise, and I'll show you how I did that later. But that is the final image that I took, was one dark frame. And this may look like a perfectly black image until you zoom in. And you can see that there are some hot pixels and a little bit of discoloration. And so this effectively captures all the dark noise in the image. So what I do is I subtracted this dark frame from the image, but it will effectively almost eliminate the dark noise